Welcome to the Putting Your Business on the Map podcast. My name is Landon Blake. I am your podcast host. Thank you for listening. Welcome to the podcast. If you're curious and you'd like to learn more, we have a special page for the podcast up at www.landonblake.com. Make sure you check that out. We've got our show notes there. You can also download the podcast in your favorite audio format. You should also be able to find the podcast on Spotify and on YouTube. So we've got the podcast episodes in both of those places. So if you use one of those apps or services, you can subscribe to the podcast there. Full disclaimer, I record most of these episodes at my home in Stockton, California. I am married to a crazy Mexican woman, and I have 2 dogs, so you may hear her or the dogs during the podcast episode. I just want to warn you ahead of time. I love all 3 of them, but they are noisy. So if you would like to sponsor a private recording studio for the podcast, make sure you reach out to me and let me know that. Otherwise, you may have some background noise. So with that disclaimer out of the way, we're going to jump right into today's episode. The title of episode 12 is The Benefits of Building a Painfully Transparent Organization. I think it's a really important part of our culture here at our company at Redefine Horizons. That's the company I manage with my friends Brian Leiser and Danny Cano. Both those guys are extremely honest men, and I appreciate that they're honest with me and honest with our employees. So honesty and transparency are important values for our company. So what are we going to talk about in the episode today? I'm going to just tell you a couple of stories about a lack of transparency that I experienced early in my career. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to build a company where that was a core value. We will define transparency. We're going to talk about why I think transparency is important when you're running a small business. We're going to talk about 9 ways that we try and be transparent here at RH. There may be other ways, but I'm going to give you the big 9. I'm not saying we do it perfectly either, but I think we are the most transparent business I have ever worked at, and I take pride in how transparent we are. Not saying that we can't do it better. So what are we not going to talk about today? We're not going to talk about how to hide stuff from your team. So if you want to know how to do that, you're in the wrong place. And I'm not going to talk today about any of the legal requirements around transparency. There are now some rules about, transparency around pay and some things like that. So I'm not going to talk about that. This is not an HR class. So let's go ahead and dive right in. I wanted to give you a couple examples from early in my surveying career, some things that happened to me that involved a lack of transparency that really shaped me as a young professional. And as I mentioned, it's part of the reason why I wanted honesty and transparency to be one of the core values of the company that I started, Redefine Horizons. And both of these examples came from a company I worked at fairly early in my career. And it was a good place to work, and I learned a lot there. It was a really, really great place to go to learn to be a land surveyor. But they were not transparent by any stretch of the word. They were one of the least transparent companies I ever worked at. They kept a lot of secrets. So they kept what everybody got paid. That was a secret. How profitable we were. That was a secret. They would do this silly thing where they would, we had 30 employees. They would buy 15 tickets to an event, and then they'd invite half the company, and then when those people wouldn't show up, they'd go and invite their second choice tier, and then if they didn't get rid of all the tickets, then they'd go invite their third tier choice, and I was usually somewhere around the second or third tier. So I was never in the first tier invites. And so they just did things like that they just didn't practice transparency as a core value. But there were two specific things that happened there that involved a lack of transparency that really bothered me. And so the first one was, so this was a company that did civil engineering and land surveying. And I had been there for several years. I'd been there long enough that I was basically
assistant survey department manager, and I was running a couple $1 million a year worth of work for those guys. And I was at the point in my career where I needed to start having access to the direct labor rates, or in other words, what we paid people. Their hourly wage on some types of government contracts, they limit your profit to your the hourly wage you pay people plus your overhead rate and then some fixed profit margin. So, for example, a lot of work for Caltrans is like that. So I started working on some of those types of proposals and contracts, and so I needed access to that information, and I don't know if it was if they thought it all the way through or not, but I ended up getting access to that information. I basically got a spreadsheet with the direct labor rate for everybody in the organization. And one of the first things that jumped out at me was there was a civil engineer there, a young civil engineer who's about my age, a little younger, and had been at the company about half as long as I had. And he made significantly more money than me. And when I say significantly, I'm not talking about 75 cents. I'm talking about several dollars. And just to be clear, this guy was my friend. I really liked him. He was a terrific engineer, and I'm still friends with him to this day. I mean, it wasn't his fault. He didn't know what I got paid. But he got paid significantly more than I did. And when I started, so that jumped out at me right away. And then I started looking around and realized that all of the junior civil engineers were getting paid more than me. And you got to remember, at this point, I'm the assistant manager to the survey department, and I'm running $1 million or $2 million a year worth of work. And so that really bothered me. And I began to realize, so this company had a habit of paying surveyors significantly less than they paid civil engineers. All the owners were civil engineers, and they kind of treated surveyors like second-class citizens. It's like no different than a company that pays women less than men, in my opinion. And so this is part of the reason why they kept people's pay rates secret. You didn't find out what the guy in the office next to you got paid. That information was kept confidential, except for just a very few people at the top of the company. And that was one of the reasons why. So that really bothered me. When I saw that, it made me wonder, what else are these folks keeping secret that I don't know about? And so I started to get suspicious. And then so the second thing that happened is I approached one of the principals there and talked to him a little bit about what the ownership transition plan was. I won't tell you the whole story. That maybe is good for another episode about leadership transition. But basically, the long story short was they told me they didn't have a transition plan. I was the first person that had asked about one, and so I had, over the course of a year, I had several different meetings with that particular principal and two of the junior civil engineers about maybe buying out the senior owner's share, coming up with a way to do that. And in hindsight, what I realized is they were basically stringing us along and stringing me along. And what I learned later, through some reliable sources after I left the company, is that they were never gonna make a land surveyor an owner, and they weren't ever gonna make a fairly outspoken and opinionated land surveyor like me an owner. And so that was obvious, and so that lack of transparency bothered me. I think they knew from the very beginning that they weren't ever going to make me an owner, and I think they. I wish they would have just told me that. We could have saved everybody a bunch of time, for one thing. But they didn't want to tell me that because they didn't want me to quit. See, they wanted to hang on to me because I was a great employee and I was running a bunch of work. But they didn't want to be honest with me about what my future prospects were at the organization. So those are two things that happened to me early in my career that really taught me how important transparency and honesty was, and that both those things really bothered me. Obviously, I'm still talking about it. I've made peace with it, but those two experiences really bothered me, and so I tried to be transparent with my teams after that. And when I started Redefine Horizons with Danny, one of the things we talked about was making honesty one of our core values. Okay, so now that we have that opening story out of the way, let's just define transparency for the purposes of this conversation that we're having today. So to me, now this I didn't take this out of a dictionary. This is my best attempt at a definition. So transparency is providing easy access to understandable and accurate information about your organization. Period. Full stop. That's it. One sentence. Okay. Now, there's some important parts of that sentence, though. Let's look at them. Provide easy access. So that's the first part. The information needs to be understandable. That's the second part. And 3, it needs to be accurate. So all of those elements are important for what I call transparency. If it's not easy to access, understandable, or accurate, it doesn't count, right? It's not transparent. So you need to do those 3 things, and we'll talk in a little bit about how you might try and implement this. Now, the other part of transparency, so this is kind of a footnote to the definition, is I think part of what that means is for a business owner, for a small business owner especially, is you have to own your decisions and be honest about them. So don't lie to your people about the way you want to run the business. Be clear about it. So, for example, one of the things I tell my team, not all the time, but occasionally, is I tell them, hey, this is not a democracy. This is a benevolent dictatorship, and I am the dictator. That means I make the final decisions. Now, it's benevolent. It's not an evil dictatorship. I try and run a benevolent dictatorship, which means I try and put the needs of the team ahead of my own needs. But I don't lie to people. Like, it is a dictatorship. It's not a democracy. It's not a representative republic. Not everybody gets a vote. I try and make sure people get to voice an opinion about decisions that are going to have a big impact on them. But that's different than a vote. There's only 2 other people in my company that get a vote, and that's my 2 business partners, because they shoulder a lot of the risk with me. Our other employees having a chance, they have an opportunity to express their opinion, but they don't necessarily get a vote. And so we don't hide that. We don't sugarcoat that. We don't pretend our company is a democracy when it's not. It's not a democracy. It's a benevolent dictatorship. If you want to come to work for me, you need to know that. So I think that's an important part of transparency. Is, don't hide who you are as a business. Be honest, and own that. So, for example, you think about the story I told you in the beginning. Like, hey, if that company I worked for early in my career wanted to pay civil engineers more than land surveyors, they had every right to do that. I don't fault them for that. Pay civil engineers more. Just be honest with your surveyors about it. Don't lie to your surveyors and pretend that you're paying them the same as the engineers if you're not doing that. If you think civil engineers deserve more money, then explain that decision, or don't explain it, but at least be honest about it. The same thing. Like, hey, if you don't want an outspoken land surveyor as part of your ownership team, that's okay. Just be honest with your surveyors about that, so they know. Like, hey, if you want to be a land surveyor with an opinion, you're not going to have a place here on the ownership team, and that's okay. People have the right to run their private businesses the way they want. What I'm telling you is transparency means being honest about how you're going to run it. And so that's part of that. That's part of that definition. All right, so why is transparency important? I have 2 reasons why I think transparency is really important to your small business. So the first one is it allows team members to put themselves and their family members first. And that's super important to me as a business owner. So how does it do that? If you're transparent about how you run the business or the condition of the business, how does it allow your employees to put themselves first? Well, it allows them to make good decisions. So, for example, when does a family make a major purchase, like a new car or a new home, right? If you're transparent with your employees about the amount of work coming in the door and how many proposals are going out and how much money is in the bank, they can assess for themselves the risk in that decision, right? I have never worked at a company that has made that kind of financial information transparent, and it makes it really hard to know how much risk to take on as a family head, right? And so that's an example. If you're transparent with people about the condition of the business and the way it's being run, then people can evaluate their own employment risk and they can make good decisions for themselves. It may not even be risk. It may be the type of work you're pursuing. Maybe team members aren't interested in that kind of work. Maybe they don't want to do single-family home subdivisions, and so they may come and talk to you and say, hey, this isn't really what I'm interested in. I think I might need to find a different place. Or, maybe it's the type of technology you want to use, and maybe they're not interested in that technology, or maybe they're really interested in it. See, the point is when you're transparent about those things, you give your team members the ability to make good decisions based on what they need, right? So that's the first reason. The second reason is it builds trust. Transparency builds trust in your team members. So why? Why does it build trust? Number one, they know you're not hiding stuff, right? So think about how I felt when I realized that civil engineer that had been at the company half as long as me was making several dollars more an hour. How did that make me feel? It made me suspicious. It made me paranoid. It made me distrustful, right? It did not engender trust. It did the opposite. So transparency builds trust. People know you're not hiding things from them. The other reason it builds trust is they can see your vulnerabilities. We're very open with our team here at RH. We're a fairly young company. We're trying to run a different kind of survey company. I don't think anybody else in California is trying to run the kind of business we're trying to run. That carries some extra risk with it. We don't like to do it, but once or twice a year we might pay people late just because we have some cash flow challenges. Early in the year, late winters, that can be, sometimes it gets hard. Sometimes we have to cut hours. We don't like doing that, but it's just part of being a small business and working in the part of the state that we work in. There are challenges to running the type of small business that we're running. There, we have vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and we're honest with our people like that. The other thing we tell them is, as the principals, we don't always have all the answers. The right decision isn't always clear. It's not always black and white. Sometimes you're making a judgment call. Sometimes we're going to make the wrong judgment call. We're very open with our people about our fallibility as principals. And I think people see that, and that engenders trust. Like, these guys are not trying to pretend to be something they're not. They're not trying to pretend to be superheroes, because we're not. We're not superheroes. We're fallible. And so when our people see our vulnerabilities, they know we're being honest. It builds trust. And then the other thing transparency does, the way it helps build trust, is it eliminates guessing or doubt or suspicion. Is that person making more money than me because she's prettier than me, or is that person making more money than me because the boss, it's the boss's cousin, or the boss and him have the same hobby. It just eliminates all that. We don't have, look, we don't have any of that kind of doubt or suspicion at my company, because we're just transparent. We're transparent about it, so people don't have to guess. So now I have a little note here in my outline, just a little sidebar. I'm telling you why transparency, why I think it's important, why you should do it. I gave you a couple reasons. This doesn't work if you want to be a selfish organization. So if you're the type of owner or boss that's all about getting yours and not worrying about what your employees get, then maybe transparency isn't a good strategy for you, right? I just told you the number one reason why transparency is important is because it allows your team members to make good decisions for themselves and their families. If you don't want that, transparency might not be the solution for you. Now, I don't think that's a good long-term strategy, but that's the way a lot of people do business. So, for example, if you want to hang on to a really talented mid-career surveyor, you might want to not be honest with him about his limited opportunities for ownership, or the fact that he's getting paid less than your civil engineer. Because if he finds that out, he or she's probably going to leave. So, transparency is only going to benefit you if you want to run a, to some extent, you want to run an honest and somewhat selfless organization, right? So, if you want to be selfish, and you want to take advantage of your employees, and transparency is probably not a great core value for you. All right, so how do you implement transparency in an organization? It's not easy. It's a very hard thing to do, especially if you work at an organization that has a secretive culture. I'm not going to say that we have it perfected. As I mentioned in the intro, I think we do a better job of it than any other company I've ever worked at. But we're not perfect, and we're still working on it. And there's a balance between how much you share and when you share it. And I'm still trying to figure some of that out. We probably overshare. I probably overshare, and so I'm trying to find that balance. So take my advice with a grain of salt. But I have 4 things that you can do if you want to. If you listen to this episode and you decide, you know what, I think Landon's right. I think I want my small business to be more transparent, or my organization. How might you do that? Okay, and we talked a little bit about in the definition, so I'm going to come back to that definition a little bit here. So here's the 4 things. Number 1, make information accessible. So don't make people go through a formal request or fill out applications in triplicate, fill forms out in triplicate to get basic information about the business. Make it easily accessible. Almost all the information my employees need to get to is easily accessible on our file server. The only exception to that is information that the law requires us to keep personally confidential. But everything else, if my folks want to get in and see what the current balance is in the business checking account, they can do that in about 3 clicks. Now, that's why I called the title of the episode Painfully Transparent. We are painfully transparent here. My folks can get in at any time and find out what the current bank balance is. Everybody that works for me knows exactly how much money I make as an owner. So we're very transparent. So make the information accessible. That's number 1. Number 2, make the information understandable. It doesn't do people any good to give them easily accessible information that they can't understand, right? So what does that mean? That means you might have to explain it. No 3,000 page reports. Don't do that. Like sometimes you have to summarize information to make it useful. So be ready to explain, summarize information where you need to. Number 3, the third way you can implement transparency in your organization is make people aware that the information is available. They forget. I work at a painfully transparent business. I think my people forget sometimes all the information we have available. They ask me questions sometimes, and I'm like, that you can just go find that, right? You don't need to ask me. And I think they forget. So make your people aware. You got to remind them, hey, if you want to know that, here's where we keep that information. You can get to it anytime. And then number 4, you have to consider how you implement transparency and still enable a reasonable amount of privacy. So you can't share everything. So for example, when I started the business, we used to have our monthly performance reviews. We call them monthly look-aheads. Those were where everybody could get to them. And I had a couple team members that came to me and said, I'm not sure I want everybody in the team on the team to have access to my monthly look-ahead. We provide some honest, constructive feedback in there. And I said, what? I think you're right. I'm sympathetic to that, and I think we can make those private. And so we've done that. So you got to take some reasonable steps there to protect people's privacy. And the other thing, this is really, really important, is, before you hire people, you need to explain to them how your transparency works. Most people are not prepared for a really transparent organization, and so you need to warn them. So, for example, you don't come to work for my business if you want what you get paid to be a secret, because we just don't do that here. So I have to tell people when I hire them, hey, we have a transparent pay scale. Everybody is going to know how much money you make to within about $3 an hour. We don't publish the exact wage rates, but we have standard roles, standard role descriptions, and a dollar value. We assign $3 to $5 bands to those roles, and if people know your role, they are going to know how much money you're making. And if you don't like that, you probably shouldn't come to work for my business. So you need to be honest with people when you hire them about that, about how the ways that you are transparent, because some people don't like that kind of transparency. All right, so to wrap up here, we are going to talk about the nine ways that we try to be transparent here at RH. And I'm not going to go into detail on these, but I'm going to run down the list. So number 1, everybody can find out how we're doing on cash flow. So we have a spreadsheet that we use to manage cash flow. I talk about that in another episode. We don't keep that locked up. Any of my employees can get into that at any time. They can see how we're doing, how much money's coming in, how much money's going out. They can see what bills are getting paid. They can see what money's coming in from what jobs and what clients. They can see if we're going to have a payroll pinch. That's in the spreadsheet. We don't keep that locked up. Anybody in my company can get to it. Number 2, we talked about this a little bit, but compensation. So people's hourly pay, their hourly wage rate, and the value of the benefits. We're pretty open about that here. Everybody knows within $3 to $4, let's say, what every other person in the company makes based on their role. Just eliminates a lot of guessing. My girls don't have to worry about if my guys are getting paid more. My ladies don't have to worry about that. My my dark-skinned employees don't have to worry about if my light-skinned employees are getting paid more. My admin staff don't have to worry about it if the surveyors are getting paid more. The people that aren't related to me don't have to worry about if the employees that are related to me are getting paid more. We eliminate all that. So we're very transparent about pay. By the way, I forgot to mention this earlier in the podcast, but there's a lot of things I think private businesses do better than the government, but transparency is not one of those things. So usually governments do a better job of transparency, especially when it comes to things like pay. So I kudos to the government, at least in the United States, for doing a better job of that. The third thing that we're transparent about here is roles and job descriptions. So everybody has a written role description. It's publicly available. That eliminates a lot of, bickering about whose job is it. If it's your job, it's in your role description, and those get revised and updated. But everybody can go see, what is Landon's job, what is Monique's job, what is the bookkeeper, what is her job, the CAD tech, what is her job. We have published roles and job descriptions. We're pretty transparent here about our hiring decisions. So we usually have a conversation or one or more conversations with the team before we hire a new team member. We talk about why we're looking to hire, who that will impact, what the person's role is going to be. So nobody ever just shows up here and has a new coworker, and they didn't, they get smacked upside the head with that surprise. We don't do that here. Let's see. Schedules. So we're super transparent about schedules, time off, how much vacation time people get. That's all super transparent. We publish a weekly schedule. Everybody's on it, including myself. We debated that for a while. I had a great project coordinator for a while, admin. She's like, I don't know why you need to be on the schedule. You're the boss. I'm like, yeah, leave me on the schedule. I think it's good. I need to play by the same rules most of my folks. I need to play by most of the rules my folks play by. So I'm on the schedule, just like everybody else. People know when I'm in the field, when I'm in the office, when I'm taking a day off. Number 6, we're pretty transparent about major purchases here. We don't make major purchases without letting the team know what's going to happen and explaining to them why we made the decision to do the major. Now, when I say major purchase, I'm not talking about $200. If it's got 5 or 6 zeros behind it, I should say 4 to 6 zeros, we are having a conversation with people. So, for example, if we're buying a new work truck or we're buying an expensive piece of survey equipment, we explain to people why we're doing that, how it might affect cash flow and things like that. Number 7, we're very transparent here about promotions. So everybody's got a pretty good career path, and we're trying to get through professional development plans for everybody. But when somebody's going to get promoted, we discuss that as a team, explain why the promotion is happening and what it means for everybody on the team and how roles might change based on that. So we discuss that. Nobody shows up here and has a new boss on Monday without knowing that was coming down the pipe. And then let's see, number 8, other major business decisions. If we're making a decision about opening a new office or moving offices or firing a major client or starting work for a new major client or taking on a big major job, we talk to our team about that. We have weekly team huddles and we talk about that kind of stuff. We're trying to teach our people how to run the business. And so we just talk about how we're making those decisions. I think that's important. So I said 9. I only have 8 here, so give me a minute. Let me think about if there's something else that we're transparent about. Here's number 9, and I talked about it a little bit. I think we're pretty transparent with folks here about when the principals make mistakes. The 3 principals here, myself included, we try and own our mistakes and be accountable for them. And I think that's pretty rare. It's an expectation we have of each other as principals, and I think our team appreciates it. So the principals here don't get to hide their mistakes, and we're not perfect. We make mistakes all the time, and so we try and be honest about those with our team. Now, just as a side note here, and I talked about this a little bit, we're transparent about those 9 things. That doesn't mean that everyone gets a vote or a veto. So, we're transparent about hiring decisions and major purchases. That doesn't mean my CAD tech that's been here 6 months gets to tell me what kind of equipment I'm going to buy or when I'm going to get a new work truck. She doesn't. But we discuss it. People get a chance to ask questions and express opinions oftentimes. So transparency doesn't necessarily mean you're giving everybody a vote or a veto. I just wanted to point that out. All right, one more section here. What types of conversations are prompted by this type of painful transparency? So you're going to find, if you decide to implement this kind of painful transparency, that it's going to prompt some conversations that you probably weren't having before, and that's okay. It's a good thing. I think these conversations need to happen. But I wanted to warn you. So what kind of conversations am I talking about? People are going to come talk to you about compensation. I would say I do that, I don't know, maybe once a month. I'm having a conversation with an employee about compensation. Those aren't conversations I initiate usually, or conversations that the team member initiates. And we're not bashful here about talking about money. I tell people we can talk about money anytime you want. You're not going to get in trouble. You're not going to offend me. Let's talk about it. When everybody in the company knows what other people are making and when they're getting promoted, that prompts conversation sometimes. Sometimes I have to be, uncomfortably honest with people during those conversations. And that's okay. That's better than being secretive. So it'll prompt conversations about compensation. I have conversations about the cost of benefits here a lot, because we adjust wages based on the cost of benefits. That's not something every company does, and people talk to me about it because it's somewhat unusual, but it's a significant cost, especially for our lower wage folks. It's a significant portion of their compensation, and so we have conversations about that. It prompts conversations about job security. And again, sometimes those conversations are uncomfortable. One of the things I tell my people is, you can't work 32 hours a week and have me and the other partners doing all the overtime. And then, when it's slow, not have me cut hours. Like if you want to stay busy in the winter, you got to work extra in the summer, or I'm going to hire people to handle that peak workload, and we're going to have more bodies to feed in January. So, we have conversations about job security and workload. And we have conversations about profitability and profit sharing. Now, we haven't had an opportunity to profit share yet. We want to do quarterly profit sharing as soon as we can. We've been putting a lot of our money back into the business. But we have conversations with our employees about, why it's important to make a profit, and how things like wages and benefits impact our ability to do that, and about how the type of clients we work for impact our ability to make a profit. And we're not bashful about making a profit with our people, and we don't apologize for it. And we have honest conversations about what's a reasonable profit and what's not reasonable. So we talk about that. All right, so in conclusion, what do we do in this episode? I talked about 2 examples of a lack of transparency from early in my career. I gave you a definition of transparency. We talked about 2 reasons why I think transparency is important in small businesses. I gave you 4 suggestions on how to implement transparency in your organization. And then we talked about 9 ways we try and be transparent, painfully transparent here at our company, RH. And then I gave you 3 or 4 examples of the type of conversations that you might have with your team, or with members of your team when you begin to implement transparency. So please subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, or iTunes. We have a Patreon page now, $10 a month. If you'd like to support the podcast, that'd be great. I have actually recorded the first couple of extras for our podcast supporters on Patreon. So I should be getting those up in the next week or 2. Please tell somebody about the podcast or share it on social media for us. Our next episode, we are going to talk about why the boss won't teach their senior party chief CAD, and we're going to talk about some of the business reasons for that. So that'll be interesting. And then the episode after that, so that the party chief CAD episode will be 13. No, yeah, will be 13. And then number 14, I think, is going to be, and I haven't scripted this yet. Number 14. I think I'm going to talk about how do you design an effective profit-sharing program. I had a question about that from a friend of mine in the business, so I wanted to try and answer his question with a podcast episode. And I don't have a bunch of answers to that, but I can tell you about some things I've thought about when it comes to profit sharing, and we can talk a little bit about how we'd like to do profit sharing at our age when we finally have the opportunity to do that. So I look forward to that. So that's what we got coming up in the hopper. All right. Appreciate you guys listening today.
That's going to wrap up our episode for today. Once again, I want to thank you guys for listening. Appreciate that. Don't forget, you can check out the podcast, download episodes, view show notes at www.landonblake.com. You can also subscribe to the podcast on YouTube and Spotify. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast or you have a suggestion for a future topic for an episode, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can find my contact information all over the web. Landon Blake, I'd love to hear from you, and we will catch you guys on the next episode. Thanks.